Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for today. We thank you for this community and this church and this diocese. Be with us now as we remember who we are in you. So we look to the future to proclaim your name. Amen. It is a joy to be back. It has been quite the journey. Wonderful to be here today. If you don't know, just real quick, my name is Joshua Daniel, and my wife and children, Ruby and Jude. Hey, Ruby! We're longtime members here at St. Paul's for about 9 years. We lived in Fayetteville and were members here, and then went through a period of discernment to go into ministry here that whole time. And 3 years ago, almost exactly, well, about a little less, moved to Alexandria, Virginia, where I've been in seminary with my family. And just yesterday, okay, funny story. The second week we were here, the second time we'd ever been to St. Paul's was for an ordination. Roger Jocelyn. I don't know if anyone remembers Roger's ordination. That was one of our first experiences here at St. Paul's, and I was already in the process of discerning at that time for ministry. And so I was like way interested in this ordination, you know? And I hadn't met Roger before. I went to him during the reception, and I was like, Roger, tell me about the process. And he was like, oh, well, it's been a long time. I was like, really? Like, what should I expect? And he was like, the average is about 10 years. And I was like, that's never going to happen for me, That was 12 years ago. So, yeah, it's a process, but it's been really good and enjoy. And so yesterday I was ordained with 5 other people, and it's just joy and honor and unreal. I thought I would talk today, this Sunday and next Sunday, about some of my experiences and my family's experiences in seminary. Talk a little bit about seminary in general, like why do this thing, like what service does it fulfill, and just kind of catalog some of my experiences. So please, anytime you have like a question or you want me to slow down or something I haven't translated from seminary speak, stop me at any time and we'll just go from there. Let's see here. Well, first of all, there we go. So, starting from the very beginning, before we moved, I had this, I was graduate school at the University of Arkansas, and through an unfortunate series of events, I ended up defending my dissertation, which I'd worked on for 5 years, just a dissertation, 2 days before we moved to Alexandria. So I went to defend. We lived at St. Martin's, which is on Maple Street. I walked across the street to Old Main, where I defended my dissertation. And then I walked back over and started to pack. And 2 days later, we drove across country with Molly and Alan and their kids. So we went from graduation to moving. There's Jude. To moving into our apartment. And that's what I looked like within the first day. That's me. Like we got like everything in. We had lots of people help, and I remember like going around town getting things. And I walked in the door, and it was just a sea of everything. And I just like literally laid down in front of the door and slept all night. I was exhausted. Anyway, so let's see. This is a picture of Jude and Ruby and one of Jude's friends, William, the week that we moved there, and a picture of them now. Ruby was just 1 when we moved, and so she totally, they've grown up a lot there. This is a picture of the seminary grounds. That's Jude manning the water sprinkler. This is one of the oldest buildings on campus called Aspinwall Hall. It was a pre-Civil War building. They used it as they used every kind of quote-unquote public building during the war as a hospital. Let's see here. This is another picture of the grounds. It's about 160 acres, the seminary campus is. And one of the best parts about seminary has been us as a family there. Jude has gotten to use that whole space like his backyard, and Ruby and Jude both have had lots of I think middle way through, they built housing on campus for all the families. There had been housing for single students, and this is our apartment building and some of the seminarians, and it's right in the middle of campus, and so that's where we've lived this time. Let's see here. These are some of the kids. There's probably about 20 kids, our kids' age. We've had to have several conversations about the importance of, there's Nerf gun wars that kind of break out, and the importance of non-combatant status. People without Nerf guns do not get shot with Nerf guns. That's something we returned to several times. Some of our very good friends and Ruby's friends, there's just lots of kids everywhere, a big rope swing. It's a really beautiful campus, one of Jude's birthday parties. And then also the worship. So the kids sometimes are brought up to the altar, as St. Paul's also does. There's a children's service. Family has in some ways been really integrated. Of course, so the seminary is in Alexandria, Virginia, which is in northern Virginia. Not that I've measured, we're 5.3 miles from the White House. And so it's just this the Washington, D.C. metro area. We're inside the Beltway, if that's a terminology you've heard. This is a picture of us in Great Falls National Park, so-called Great Falls because there's like these big waterfalls, the Potomac. And they had to build canals. So here's the point of this. I was very tempted to just take pictures of the Supreme Court building and, be like, oh, this is someplace I went, but I'm not going to do that. But, so Great Falls, and so here's the relevant story. Here's what you need to know about the culture of Northern Virginia. This was a ranger who stopped us as we were walking by and was talking to our kids, and he said, you see this rock? And she was like, no. He's like, come over here and stand on it. And so Jude said, okay. And he goes, does anything look interesting about this rock? And Jude goes, nope. And he goes, so right next to Jude's right foot, there's it looks like a leaf. It's a hole. He goes, you see that hole? Jude goes, yeah. He goes, George Washington used that hole to put his survey equipment in it to build the canals here. I got that type of story probably 100 different times. George Washington has touched every rock, has walked on every trail. Literally, the first 6 churches I visited in Alexandria all claim to be founded by George Washington. I'm not kidding. Every single one of them. And I think there's actually, as all mythical stories, there's a bit of truth there. George Washington had a lot of money. He helped fund a lot of the new churches, and they're all Episcopalian. And so finding a church to serve at was one of the first things that they tasked us to do. So as seminarians, we have to find basically an internship. And so we travel to different churches the first year. Northern Virginia, that's kind of where the Episcopal Church started. That's like the heartland of the Episcopal Church. It's very different, in my experience, than in the Diocese of Arkansas. The kind of culture of the Diocese of Virginia and the Dioceses of Washington, D.C. Partly because, there's lots of theories here about why that is, but I think partly because Some of these churches have been around, are as old as the country, if not older. And they've had some of the members of the church, some of the members' family of the church, back generations, founded the church. Anyway, the people have been there for a long time, basically. And so getting to go around and visit them was really neat. This is actually a church in Washington, D.C. Several. So anyway, so there's like 130 Episcopal churches within 40 miles of the seminary. So there's literally, within an hour's drive, you couldn't visit every church if you went to a different church every Sunday for the 3 years of seminary. There's a lot. And so I eventually, after visiting several, came upon this church. It's called Church of the Epiphany. This is where I was an intern. They called it Field Education. And Church of the Epiphany is in downtown D.C. You can't see very well, but where the trees start, those are the trees that are in front of the White House. So it's just a block and a half. It was a church that was started in the early 1800s, and back when that was an actual neighborhood in Washington, D.C. And so it was a neighborhood parish. They had people who walked there. Fast forward 200 years, and there's no neighborhoods. It's all law offices and other corporate buildings. And so about 20 years ago, 30, the church had a major cultural shift and stopped really functioning as a neighborhood parish and started functioning more as a social justice church, a church with a strong social justice emphasis. And so there's just a huge homeless population in D.C., and they have, every Sunday, they feed 200 homeless people in between the services. And a large portion of them, so a regular morning at Epiphany is they open the doors at 6, and they have a list. And they use the list, the homeless people can come in and sign up for the list, and then they use that list to call in order for lunch. Now, once you're on the list, you can leave and come back for breakfast. You don't have to stay. A large portion of them do stay, and so there's about 100 of them who worship together at the 8 o'clock service. It is a powerful service, and it's been an incredible place for me to serve at. In a lot of ways, it reminded me of when I was a college, a chaplain at a hospital. I would stand out in front of the doors before the service, and literally people would come up several times, fall into my arms, crying. A lot of the people who were at that church were in crisis, emotional, spiritual, physical, and it was every week something crazy happened in church. And, it's kind of, at some point, you have to laugh and take it in stride. Several of my sermons, I had someone stand up and start yelling at me for whatever reason. It is like real training, I literally broke up 2 different fights in church, set down my prayer book and, went to break up a fight. Also, on the other end of the spectrum, just genuine worship happening. And it is a powerful and humbling thing to see someone who is homeless tithe when the plague goes around, to literally give up a huge portion of their total assets to the church. And I've been incredibly blessed by so many of those relationships that I've had for almost 3 years now. Take that with me. Let's see here. This is inside kind of parish garden. This is inside the church, just really beautiful Gothic-style parish. This is myself and some fellow seminarians and one of the priests. And so another part of being in the kind of Washington, D.C. area is, and at the seminary, we would have Episcopal dignitaries. Now, these are not like people that normal people know, but like Episcopalians get really excited about. And so my second year at Epiphany, we found out that Archbishop Rowan was stopping by and wanted to celebrate the Eucharist and preach at our church. And Rowan is one of my all-time heroes, both as a priest and as a bishop, but also as a theologian. I don't know, Lynn, what do you think? I think he's one of the most respected living theologians alive. Is that an overstatement? Yeah. And seminary has been really great. I had gone in having read some theology, but the breadth of the theology that I got to read expanded a lot, and I got to read through a lot of what Rowan Williams. Anyway, he's just really wonderful. So, what to do when you're meeting an archbishop? Well, super humble. He didn't want to talk to me. He wanted to talk to our parish, to the homeless congregation, and which was great. And he was very intentional and very personal and very present with them. A really great story I told Suzanne earlier. We were sitting up on the platform, and the priest of the parish looked over at me, and she said, "Have you ever cleared off the table for communion?" And I said, "No, I don't think so." She goes, "Why don't you go ahead and give it a try?" with Rowan sitting right there, and I was like, I would love to, and so one thing about the liturgy that's really nice is that it's supposed to be pretty normal, So clearing off the altar table should be a lot like clearing off the dinner table. And yet it's not quite just like clearing off the dinner table. And so I got up there and I was like, what goes first, And so I just started taking things off, and out of the corner of my eye, the head of the altar gill, I see her do this. Oh. I was like, I don't know what just happened. I'm sure everyone else does, but it was great. And real seminary experience. Okay, so after the first year, during the first year, one of the other big things that we have to do is find a chaplaincy placement. It's the Episcopal version of seminary hazing, and that is for 8 to 10 weeks, usually in the first summer, you work at a chapel. You work at a hospital as a chaplain. And tons of hospitals in the area, but the hospital in D.C., that's the Level 1 Trauma Center, where all of the major trauma cases in the D.C. metro area, within, I think, 40 or 60 miles, goes to this hospital, Washington Hospital Center, which is where I applied and got accepted to. It's a hospital that has 900 beds. It's a huge complex. This is the front of it. I think I've got another picture of the larger. Yeah, and there's a children's hospital that's connected. That's in the top left. Off screen is the VA, which is also enormous, and then a rehab clinic, and then the hospital's in the middle part of it. Okay, so here's another great Northern Virginia or DC area story. During our training, they said, this is an important hospital to be at. If the president is injured, we are the hospital that he comes to, or she. Now, us seminarians got together and we were talking about our first weeks of seminary, and every single hospital tells every single one of their employees that the president comes. If the president gets injured, he comes to our hospital. Now, again, there's a bit of truth to it because, as you can imagine, the Secret Service has like 300 different contingency plans. So, of course, like probably every hospital in the area falls on that list somewhere. But my very first night in the trauma center, so once a week, each seminarian, and the seminarians came from all over, where there was Lutheran in my group, there was Pentecostal, 2 Pentecostal charismatic seminarians, and then 2 from myself and another one of my seminarian friends, and 4 Roman Catholics, a nun, and 2 monks who are all Franciscan. Anyway, so each of us are assigned an overnight shift in the level 1 trauma center. And the very first night, about 3 in the morning, it's just crazy in the trauma center. And all of a sudden, all these men with wearing suits and earpieces, like clearly Secret Service, kind of flood in the building. And I look out the window of the helipad, and Marine One is landing. And it was just like a test run, the president wasn't there, but I was just like, what is going on? It was, where am I? Okay, so so every gunshot, every knife wound, every fire burn in the DC area came to this hospital. And so every night it was the Army, the medics for the Army train at this hospital before they go to their field assignments overseas. So a really great story. My friend, fellow seminarian, was, so as chaplains, we kind of stay out of the emergency surgeries, but we're there in case someone wants to pray. But part of their policy is that when anyone comes into the level 1 trauma center, there is a chaplain present. It's just part of their policy. And so most of the people in the level 1 trauma center are like, what? Who is that person in the cassock? Like, what are they doing? They're just standing there. But some of the doctors really use the chaplains. And one particular story that stood out was my friend Charles, on his first or second week there, was standing in the back, and he was even further back, I think, than most of the chaplains. And there's 7 different med bays in the trauma center. They were all full. And one of the ER doctors looked up and looked right at Charles, and she said, "You." Charles looking around, and he goes, "What are you doing?" And he was like, "I'm just a chaplain." And she goes, "How are you with blood?" And he goes, I don't know, what do you need? And she goes, "Can you come over and help me?" And she had run out of orderlies, and this was like totally against the rules, but it happened. And so he came over, and she goes to the seminarian, "No matter what happens, do not let go of this man's leg." And he goes, "Okay." And she turned to the patient, and she goes, "Sir, you have a very bad injury. There's no time for anesthesia. I have to operate now." And she pulls out what looked to me as a sawzall. And Charles almost fainted. I mean, it was, that is the type of thing they put us through. I mean, I just wanted to be a priest, But the serious thing is when I started, I was pretty suspicious of what chaplains do in hospitals. I thought, people go into a hospital and they want to get fixed and they want to get out. And it seemed to me that chaplains, sometimes, you may or may not have experience with this, People who have taken on religious vows have maybe a slightly high sense of their importance. I don't know if you've ever experienced anything like this. And I kind of thought, my suspicion was that in these hospitals, that chaplains were mostly kind of in the way and trying to garner some importance for themselves. My experience in the hospital was radically challenged that skepticism. I was assigned neonatal step-down unit, so after babies who had been delivered so the babies who had to go into intensive care, a NICU, once they were not ready to go home, but they were no longer in critical condition, they went to a different floor, and I was a chaplain for that floor, and a chaplain for a couple of other floors that had lots of different names, but really the only type of person I saw during the week was people with cancer. And I couldn't figure out why, because there was all sorts of people on the floor. Mostly what I would do is I'd come to the floor and I would talk to one of the nurses and ask them who would more than likely like to talk to someone, talk to a pastor. And I think that got me mostly just to cancer rooms. And my idea of what it would be was that I would be talking to a different person every time. But the truth was that there was 6 people that I spent most of the summer with and who at the end died. Spent 5 or 6 weeks with them. One woman came in only symptomatic. Came in, she thought she had the flu or a cold, had stage 4 terminal cancer, and in 4 weeks she had passed. So it was, so back to my skepticism, I came out thinking that the most important person in the hospital were the nurses, clearly. The nurses they never took breaks, they were always working hard, they got sent in to do the hardest work, and then the orderlies and the doctors were somewhere. But on that list of people who were chaplains. And the reason is almost every room I walked into, people were desperate to talk about their life, often desperate to talk about God. And really just to listen. I didn't do much talking. Sometimes one of the gifts was getting to watch other people be chaplains. The hospital is in northeast Washington, which is where Catholic University is, and also the Catholic Basilica, which is this. I showed pictures because I thought I'd talk about it, but we're running out of time. If you ever go to the area, the Catholic Basilica is just amazing. And partly it's because I never worked with or really had known Catholic clergy, so I didn't know much about them. And the 3 Franciscans became very close friends of mine and took me to the Basilica and also to their monastery. And the Catholic Church does really incredible ministry, and partly because there's lots of factors, I think. These are all my pet theories, so who knows if they're right or not. Mostly because they're not allowed to marry. So the Franciscan brothers found out a week before. They were in Boston, in a monastery in Boston, and the order of the friars came out and was like, you guys are going to Washington, D.C. To work in the hospital there for an internship, And they got on a train and went to the monastery in D.C., and that's where they lived. And because of the huge infrastructure that the Catholic Church has, most of the people, the full-time people that worked for the Department of Spiritual Care as a chaplain were Catholic. And one woman, who's not pictured here, as a nun, I shadowed her a couple of days and learned just the basic fundamentals of of pastoral ministry from her. She would walk into a room, and, the other thing is as Catholics, they have a list of all the Catholics in the hospital. I don't know where that list came from, but they had it. And she would walk in, and they would talk about, so-and-so. They always knew somebody. And she would take their hand, and as they were talking, just massage it, get warmth down into the fingers. And then they had a couple of songs I had never heard that every Catholic in that hospital knew. And then they would say the Lord's Prayer, and then she would just sing to them. And she never stopped smiling, no matter how bad it was. And anyway, it was just the image of Jesus incarnate to me. Anyway, so I have like a confident sense of my ability in a lot of things, taught philosophy classes, loved it, and every time I have a sense of I can do this. This was the first job that I had. First 5 weeks went really well. I had this reservoir of spiritual and psychological and emotional strength that just slowly depleted. And after the 5th week, I was bone dry, and it was a raw last few weeks. And after this experience, it was clear I was not called to work in a hospital for full time. The people who are angels in our midst. I'm not sure how anyone does it full time. Nevertheless, fast forward the next year, and I did an internship in Southern Maryland. Let's see if I have a picture of this. No, Palestine. Did an internship in Southern Maryland, and it was my first time working full-time for a church. And a big part of that was doing pastoral home visits. And it was that training in the hospital. Yeah, Bob? Yeah, that's a picture of you. Do you remember that? That was me on the way to the hospital. A big part of that pastoral care was what I had learned working as a chaplain. So it was one of those things that was just fundamental, important, also something that I had to walk away from at the end. Any questions? Thoughts? Yes, please.
Comment and a question.
Yeah, please.
I've been worshiping here about 2 years.
Yeah.
It's nice to meet you because this church has prayed for you every time I'm here.
Yes.
You're on and I thought it was so neat to be praying for a seminarian.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
to see you.
Yeah.
Congratulations on
Yes.
And then the second thing is, what's your undergrad and grad? What was your dissertation? Just some basic.
Oh, yeah, sure. Please, thanks. I did a PhD in philosophy and wrote my dissertation on Wittgenstein. And I'd done a master's thinking that I might go to seminary after the master's, and the timing didn't work out. And so I signed up for the PhD and went to my advisor. And I said, look, I think my hope is to be working for the church as my vocation, but I would really like to write a dissertation, and can we do it on some religious topic? And so I did Wittgenstein in religion, was what my dissertation was on. And it was really great and helpful, a great training for seminary. And it's been something that I reflected on and brought with me to a lot of my classes. So thanks for the question. Yeah, Jude. Oh, well, when she was operating? I don't know, Jude. That's a great question. The story ended there, bud, but I'm sure everything ended fine. Yes, David.
Could you describe something about the classroom work of seminary?
Yes.
Courses or a brief description of the courses?
Okay, that's a perfect place to end. Most days, they step back and talk about theological education. The number of Episcopal seminaries is shrinking. In the last few years, 3 of them have either shut down or greatly altered in the last 5 years. And that follows a general trend of institutions in general, our great public institutions, shrinking and contracting. So the debate, the difficulties that colleges are facing are many of the same difficulties that seminaries are facing. And the Episcopal Church also has shrunk a bit in the last few years. And so part of that is that there are fewer places for seminarians to do a year as an assistant, as a curate. And so I'm not sure if everyone knows, but have received a call to be a priest in charge at St. Mark's, Jonesboro, which we are thrilled and excited about. But in the past, most seminarians have come out to be assistants to curates for a year, basically an extended year of training in a lot of ways as priests. But there's a shortage of priests, and they needed several of us are going straight in to places that will be the only priest on staff now. So why that's relevant to the question about seminary is that seminaries are having to do more with less. There's less seminaries, but what they're expected to train the people who come has gotten a lot bigger. For a long time, the seminaries thought, look, if we just do Bible, we just do history, we just do liturgy and systematic theology, already we're still doing a lot, they'll get a lot of the practical stuff when they get to there. But because so many priests are going straight in, there's more and more pressure on them to be a lot more practically minded. So Virginia Seminary has absorbed a lot of the other seminary students. So in my time, the enrollment has gone up substantially, partly because the seminary built those apartments, and it's one of the nicest, the resources of that seminary are great. So the difficulty in answering the question is what my first year looked like on a day-to-day basis was totally different than my last year. First year, we had morning prayer, classes, a Eucharist in the middle of the day, and then we'd have lunch, classes, evening prayer at the end. And every year, that kind of got shuffled around because the seminary is in a period of adjustment, partly because they have a new chapel, but partly because they're taking on more and more responsibilities. So kind of stepping a step back, there was classes in practical theology and liturgy. So literally, we had a class called Manual Acts. Any guess what Manual Acts is a class on? Yes, exactly. So, yes, exactly. The manual acts of the service. And so the liturgy professor, was just fantastic, would stand up at the front and he would say, everyone stand up and let me see you say, the Lord be with you. So he'd say, the Lord be with you. You know, and everyone, like, what do you do with your hands? Now, depending on how many Episcopal churches you've been to, you know, there's a wide range of how people do manual acts. And so he'd say, so, you know, do it, and everyone would do it. And he goes, now I want you to try something really different. And my particular charism in seminary was, what's the kid-friendly term? To be the person who slightly undermined the intent of the professor, yeah. And so he said, you know, the Lord be with you. He goes, and I want you to do something very different. And I said, the Lord be with you. You know, that seemed to me to be the opposite thing. And he laughed. Well, it's a lot of my seminary. Okay, so the culture at the seminary was a lot different than what I expected. So this is kind of getting back to the sense in which the Episcopal Church on the East Coast, in the mid-Atlantic states, particularly in Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina, the Episcopal Church is, in some ways, I don't mean this politically, a very conservative institution. They're conserving the power that they've had for a really long time in those local regions. And that wasn't something that I had experienced. So there was a huge breadth of students there. So lots of other seminaries get, I think, a more particular type. And we were getting people from everywhere. A lot of people from the South, a lot of people from the Northeast and the West and Midwest. And so one of the things that really surprised me was the very wide political spectrum that's still represented in Episcopal clergy. And one of the things that I'll get into more next week, but the summer that before I started seminary, the July before I started seminary, Donald Trump announced his candidacy for president. So that's been, I don't know seminary without Trump being a part of our political discourse. That really affected what seminary was like. It affected the kind of conversations that we could have, but also the type of conversations that we couldn't have, because things were so politically charged and have been really for the last, for a long time, but in a particularly different way the last 3 years. David, how did I do on answering your question?
Give you a beat.
Okay, perfect. As they say in seminary, C's for caller.
Well, I just
The letter
think,
grant.
like, you take Bible, you take
Yeah.
history,
Yeah.
theology, and then
Yeah.
there's got to be some period in there where you like do the manual acts, like how do you actually do things. Like when you had communion this morning, I mean, there's certain movements that everybody's supposed to learn how to do.
Yeah, like take the lid out of the chalice before you pour. Yeah. Those are one of the things they didn't teach us, so I didn't know.
When are you going to Jonesboro?
July. Yeah.
They throw you right in the fire, right?
Yes, that's right. So the nice thing is that the seminary recognizes that that's the situation for a lot of us, and so we've gotten just a wide scattershot of training, and there's a very large faculty. We do a year of Bible, a year of history, a year of systematics, and then there's a whole range. One of the best classes I took was on pastoral offices, and a priest who had retired, who was just beloved, would come in and just talk about how to do a funeral, how to do weddings, how to do baptisms. And not just like in a theoretical way, but like, here's where you stand during the wedding, and then you move here at this point. And every church is different. That's something that they really emphasize, because each building is different. The where you stand part changes, and for good theological reason. So let me just end with why go to seminary? Like, what's the point? What were we hoping? One of the things that I've learned is that seminary was 3 years of a much larger training that I've had. And a huge part of that training was the 9 years I was here. 4 years on staff, but just as a parishioner. And I would go to staff meetings, and Lowell and Suzanne, and everybody would be talking about this, but when we got to the liturgy, Lowell and Suzanne would kind of think, and something would happen, and they'd say, how do we respond to this? Do we need to change? Do we need to keep the same? Do we need to do something different? And every time, they relied on a vast, deep river of theological and spiritual insight to make those decisions. And so when it came to me to talk about it, I would say, I don't know, before going to seminary, how do you make this type of decision? I don't know. And so the thing that seminary has really laid upon me is that whether we're talking about history or systematic theology or liturgy, the thing that really draws this church together is Jesus. Right. I know, Episcopalians, come on, guys. Let me just talk about one aspect of the liturgy that really, the way that they talked about it. The broad strokes of the liturgy. The very first thing that we do that actually every church does is assemble as we come together. And before seminary, I had thought about that as just being the beginning of the service, right? What they try to do is to push it a little bit further, to go a little bit deeper. And one of the ways that I've come to see it now is that the assembly starts when we turn our hearts to church. We're all in different professions, different walks of life at different parts. And some of us live in very stressful jobs. And some of us are in really difficult life circumstances. Some of us are in times of celebration. The liturgy starts when you put down the hammer or the book or the tire, whatever you do, and you start to turn your life towards here for a period of coming together in praise and thanksgiving. This is the gospel of Christ. It's what fundamentally orients our liturgy, thanksgiving. Coming together to do things. So, to me, those were the things that really were important to me for seminary, was thinking about the kind of fundamental theological things. So the life of Jesus, the gospel of Jesus is complex. Thanksgiving was a big part of it. A big part of Jesus' ministry was criticizing the religious authority. Like, the religious authority in the ancient Palestine bore the brunt of Jesus' most harsh criticism. The religious authority now is us. Oftentimes we think of Jesus like going after the Pharisees. The Pharisees are somebody else. No, the Pharisees, the people with collars, are the people who are likely to fall into Phariseeism. Anyway, so all of that is part of the liturgy. So part of our liturgy is appreciating when it breaks apart. When it doesn't just flow perfectly smoothly, but when it breaks apart and we think, that wasn't planned, but the Spirit is here. Okay, I think we got time for maybe one more question, and then we've got to go. Thank you all. I look forward to getting another swing at next week. We have a trip to Palestine and my experiences there, and also some of the political, religious action that, as a seminary, we took in the last couple of years. Thank you for your time, and honor to be here.